Hey, welcome to the Plunge with Derek Holser. Today's guest is returning favorite Bret Brink. He returns with us during Tolkien's Greatest Characters. Here we are, episode 4, discussing the poem, The Sea Bell, also known as Frodo's Dream. When I think about Bret, I think about what the critic William Empson said of C.S. Lewis, and that is that Lewis was the best read man of his generation who read everything and remembered everything that he read. Every time I walk away from a conversation with Bret, I'm reminded of that quote. For I think there are few people under the age of 30 who are as well read as Bret and who remember and bring together the threads of the beautiful harmony of writers through the ages as Bret does. Though he is yet a PhD student at the University of Toronto, in the years and decades to come, I guarantee you will know the name Bret Brink. I am so thankful that you're here today, and I am so grateful that Bret chose once again to take the plunge. Let's dive in. Bret, how you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing very well today. It's nice and sunny here, so it's fantastic.
And we last spoke about, I don't know, 7 months ago. And at that point, I can't recall if you had landed on your program for studies. But would you update us on where you're at now and what you're working on?
Yes, so the last time we talked, I was finishing my MA at the University of Toronto, my MA in English, and I have since started the PhD in the English program, also at the University of Toronto.
And how's it going?
It's fantastic. I was here last year, so I know the area, I know the department, and it's all lovely. It's all fantastic. It's a fantastic program, fantastic people, fantastic all around.
Is there anything you would say that you've noticed as a difference between, living West Coast Canada growing up to the Toronto area?
Oh, yes. I feel like people are a bit more fast paced here, a bit more in a hurry, the usual stereotype. And just like the difference of space is quite different because I'm from the Fraser Valley, the rural part of the Fraser Valley, so I'm used to green fields and tall mountains instead of very flat land, but lots of tall buildings very close. So that's an adjustment. But it's also interesting because in the East Coast you get tons of lovely old buildings, especially in the university area here. So that's always lovely.
Good. And is there an area of emphasis for your research that you could tell us about?
Yes, my research interests are evolving, so this could change quite quickly. But one thing that I'm interested in currently is John Milton, the poet, the author of Paradise Lost, and the way that he has been received and interpreted by American poets such as Emily Dickinson and Wallace Stevens. So I'm trying to see how they echo Milton in their poetry, and then how that might help us approach Milton with fresh eyes.
Lovely. I recall in our last conversation you aspired to be a Miltonist. And would you say that is still a driving force in your life?
Yes, and well, maybe not. You know, these days I probably would want to be a bit more humble in my aspirations than saying I want to be a Miltonist. I want to be an early modernist. I want to be a poetry critic. I want to be someone who works on Milton. But so I guess that is tantamount to saying I want to be a Miltonist, but I also want to do other things.
Understood. Understood. Well, you've always impressed me with your insight, your thoughtfulness, and so I'm really excited that you were able to join the Tolkien Greatest Characters series. This sucker's going to have like 16 episodes, and so a really robust conversation from a variety of perspectives on different characters. I wanted to, before we get into that, I would love to hear your account of first discovering Tolkien in your life.
Yes. So, how did I first discover Tolkien? I guess this was back in grade four, it must have been. Grade four for sure. I'm not sure how old I was, probably 9 or 10, that kind of age, whenever people are in grade four. But there was a book fair at our school. Every year there would be some kind of event where the library would be filled with extra books more than usual for sale. And at this book sale, it was a few day long thing, and one of the books or sets of books that they had there was The Lord of the Rings. They had the mass market paperback, very cheap and cheaply made, tiny, tiny print copy of The Lord of the Rings. And I believe it was $30 in total. I didn't have money with me, so I went home that day and I was like, Mom, can I have money for these books? And she was like, I don't know, Brett. Those 3 books are expensive. Have you read anything by this author? No. Has he written anything you could read? And so then I did research, probably. I didn't have a phone at that point, so it must have been on the family's computer. So I did that, and I found The Hobbit existed. And so then the next day I got The Hobbit, and then I loved it and fell in love with it and read it instantly, so that before the book fair was over, I was able to then get a copy of The Lord of the Rings. And that I did not devour instantly. I read it over the course of a month or so. And that was before I had a phone or anything like that. So I had lots of time, all the time that nowadays I'd be doing whatever people do with computers and phones and devices and all that. That time I'd spend reading. And so every night before bed I'd read through The Lord of the Rings, and in the course of a month I made it through it. And so that's how I fell in love with Tolkien.
Lovely. And I assume part of the context there being as young as you were, The Hobbit was a little easier to take in. Would that be correct?
Yes, yes. I mean, for sure. And then that's why the difference of the time scales of reading The Hobbit instantly, then slowly working my way through The Lord of the Rings. But it's lovely. I mean, there's such a richness in both works, but especially The Lord of the Rings, that what gave me something to dig my teeth into. My favorite book up until that point had been The Secret Garden, which is itself, a children's novel appropriate for that age, but and also a slightly older work. So then language from that period, early 20th century, was something that I enjoyed back then and still enjoy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you have a passion for language and an understanding of its effect in a way that I think few your age possess. And so, not to blow puffery upon you, but I do find your articulations on X and your reflections with respect to the work of Dickinson, Milton, many others. So those of you who are listening, if you've not started following Bret on X, I would encourage you to do that. Um, One of the things that stands out to me is your deep love for poetry. And could you just speak to, other than perhaps uh, just a draw to it that might not be able to be defined, and maybe you can define it. What is so enticing to you about poetry?
What is so enticing to me about poetry? Part of it is just that vague, undefinable, je ne sais quoi kind of quality. Part of it is, I feel like everyone loves poetry initially, or just about everyone. I think that as kids, most of our books have some kind of meter or rhyme that is very bodily, it's very primordial in that sense. Northrop Frye has this wonderful thing in The Well Tempered Critic where he says that, what does he say? That an ideal beginning of a literary education should be a child being read a nursery rhyme and bounced on the knee of the person reading them that rhyme to the rhythm of the poem. And I think that that kind of bodily experience is something that's very connected in poetry. It's something that it's one of the most bodily forms of the literary arts, which I find appealing, especially in this age where everything's now turning digital and then there's AI, so it's a very disembodied. It feels poetry seems grounded to me in a way, even though some people might associate it with building castles in clouds or whatever. Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think one of the words you use there, the primordial sense, is really important. And I think about Owen Barfield's work, Poetic Diction, and his reflection. I think Tolkien as well, because Tolkien would have commented on Barfield's work influencing him with respect to the evolution of language and poetry being, in Barfield's estimation, I don't know what your thoughts are, but it's good poetry is the pinnacle of communication.
Yes, I would think that I should be careful of what I say about this just because I don't want to insult any colleagues that work on things other than poetry. And it is partly my prejudices, I'm sure, as a poetry person. But I do find an intensity in poetry that is hard to find anywhere else. And of course, maybe I shouldn't even apologize to people who don't work on poetry, because some of our divisions in these matters are somewhat arbitrary. If
Hmm.
you talk about older poetry or discussions of poetry that go longer back, it tends to be discussions of imaginative literature more broadly. And so, in its oldest sense, poetry can be a very widely encompassing thing and a qualitative rather than a quantitative thing, so that you get basically in, say, a text by Pseudo Longinus on the Sublime, among the things that are being discussed is Genesis and prose works and things, as though they fell as neatly into the category of poetry as, say, the Iliad.
Very interesting. Well, we're here today to discuss a poem, and even though it's Tolkien's greatest characters, this is a little bit of a variation. But I'd love for you to tell us the poem and then kind of any history around it, and its purpose and effect. I believe it's alternately known as the Sea Bell or Frodo's Dream. Tell us what you know about it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So one of the reasons that this was an interesting choice for me is that I've never formally studied this poem. With When we talked about MacDonald, I was freshly preparing for the George MacDonald conference that was happening or coming out of that. I forget the time scale. But George MacDonald was very fresh on my mind in an academic sense. And though I've done some research on Tolkien, it's mostly Lord of the Rings focused. So I'm not the best situated to say the context of the poem, other than that it is written by Tolkien, who was a profound student of languages, of philology, of the evolution of languages, and a lover of fairy stories and fairy tales, who was deeply knowledgeable about the conventions and the history of those things. And this poem fits generically into a kind of narrative where someone is lured into fairyland for some reason or goes through some experience which leaves them changed. You have, I don't know, William Butler Yeats has the Song of the Wandering Angus, which might be familiar, or Samuel Taylor Coleridge has the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. They don't fit perfectly, but they're analogous poems, which I think is helpful.
That makes sense. Before we discuss it, would you be willing to read it? Do you have it there?
Oh yes, I do. Yes, I
Lovely.
have. The lovely edition. Um, Edited by Christina Skull and Wayne G. Hammond, with the lovely illustrations by Pauline Baines. So, yes, if you don't have a copy of the book, I highly recommend getting it. It's a tiny, lovely read. The Sea Bell. I walked by the sea, and there came to me, as a starbeam on the wet sand, a white shell, like a sea bell, trembling it lay in my wet hand. In my fingers shaken I heard waken a ding within, by our harbor bar, a boy swinging, a call ringing, over endless seas, faint now and far. Then I saw a boat silently float, on the night tide, empty and grey. It is later than late, why do we wait? I leapt in and cried, bear me away. It bore me away, wetted with spray, wrapped in a mist, wound in a sleep, to a forgotten strand in a strange land, in the twilight beyond the deep. I heard a sea bell swing in the swell, dinging, dinging, and the breakers roar on the hidden teeth of a perilous reef, and at last I came to a long shore. White it glimmered, and the sea simmered, with star mirrors in a silver net. Cliffs of stone pale as rule bone, and the moon foam were gleaming wet. Glittering sand slid through my hand, dust of pearl and jewel grist, trumpets of opal, roses of coral, flutes of green and amethyst. But under cliff eaves there were glooming caves, weed-curtained, dark and grey. A cold air stirred in my hair, and the light waned as I hurried away. Down from a hill ran a green rill, its water I drank to my heart's ease. Up its fountain stair to a country fair, of ever eve I came, far from the seas. Climbing into meadows of fluttering shadows, flowers lay there like fallen stars, and on a blue pool, glassy and cool, like floating moons the nenuphars. Alders were sleeping, and willows weeping, by a slow river of rippling weeds. Gladden swords guarded the fords, and green spears and arrow reeds. There was echo of song all the evening long, down in the valley, many a thing running to and fro, hairs white as snow, revolves out of holes, moths on the wing with lantern eyes. In quiet surprise, brocks were staring out of dark doors. I heard dancing there, music in the air, feet going quick on the green floors. But wherever I came, it was ever the same. The feet fled, and all was still. Never a greeting, only the fleeting pipes, voices, horns on the hill. Of river leaves and the rush sheaves I made me a mantle of jewel green, a tall wand to hold, and a flag of gold. My eyes shone like the stars' sheen. With flowers crowned I stood on a mound, and shrill as a call at cockcrow, proudly I cried, why do you hide? Why do none speak wherever I go? Here now I stand, king of this land, with gladdened sword and reed mace. Answer my call, come forth all, speak to me words, show me a face. Black came a cloud as a night shroud, like a dark mole groping I went, to the ground falling, on my hands crawling, with eyes blind and my back bent. I crept to a wood, silent it stood in its dead leaves, bare were its boughs. There must I sit, wandering in wit, while owls snored in their hollow hells. For a year and a day there must I stay. Beetles were tapping in the rotten trees, spiders were weaving in the mold heaving, puffballs loomed about my knees. At last there came light in my long night, and I saw my hair hanging grey. Bent though I be, I must find the sea. I have lost myself, and I know not the way, but let me be gone. Then I stumbled on, like a hunting bat shadow was over me. In my ears dinned a withering wind, and with ragged briars I tried to cover me. My hands were torn, and my knees worn, and ears were heavy upon my back. When the rain in my face took a salt taste, and I smelt the smell of sea wrack. Birds came sailing, mewing, wailing. I heard voices in cold caves, seals barking and rocks snarling, and in spout holes the gulping of waves. Winter came fast, into a mist I passed, to land's end my years I bore. Snow was in the air, ice in my hair, darkness was lying on the last shore. There stood afloat waited the boat, and the tide lifting, its prow tossing. Weary I lay as it bore me away, the waves climbing, the seas crossing. Passing old halls clustered with gulls, and great ships laden with light, coming to haven, dark as a raven, silent as snow, deep in the night. Houses were shuttered, wind round them muttered, roads were empty, I sat by a door, and where drizzling rain poured down a drain, I cast away all that I bore. In my clutching hand some grains of sand, and a seashell silent and dead. Never will my ear that bell hear, never my feet that shore tread, never again, as in sad lane, in blind alley and in long street, ragged I walk, to myself I talk, for still they speak not, men that I meet.
How lovely. Thank you so much. What a poem. What a story. I'd love to begin with a question that I had as I read it. And I must confess, the first time I ever read it is when you suggested we discuss it. So it's new to me. And obviously, it's an ode to transitioning to fairyland, perhaps. But the thing that kept coming to me is like the passing from death to life. And I wonder if you could speak to Faerie and that transition state, maybe the liminal passage, whatever it might be, that is happening in this poem, but also happens, I think, in all these great tales.
Yes, I mean it's very interesting. I I would pause before interpreting it as a passage from death to life, although that's certainly tenable just because of Tolkien's own famous distaste for allegory. Though, of course, his own famous work that he said was an allegory was Leaf by Niggle, which is itself to do with life and death in that passage and that liminal space, so it makes sense. But what happens in the poem's opening? The protagonist finds a seashell and hears the music of the sea within it, and this ignites a passionate yearning within him, leading him to an adventure in fairyland. John Keats tells us that the nightingale's song ofttimes hath charmed magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas and fairylands forlorn, and the seashell, the sea bell, in this poem has a similar effect. And I think partly this is due to the fact that it's due to the central role that Tolkien gave water in his legendarium. In his creation story for Middle-earth, he tells us, "It is said by the Eldar that in water there lives yet the echo of the music of the Ainur, more than in any substance else that is in this earth, and many of the children of Iluvatar, the god of that world, hearken still unsated to the voices of the sea, and yet know not for what they listen." And that idea seems to me analogous to the restless heart that Augustine speaks about in his Confessions, where he writes, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." Lewis, it seems, approaches the point from a different angle in The Weight of Glory, when he writes, "The books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. It was not in them, it only came through them, and what came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, are good images of what we really desire. But if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshippers. For they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited." And it seems to me that a tune that we have not heard, the news from a country we haven't visited, are very resonant with this poem specifically. And I think that's because that Tolkien is trying to get at this painful yearning that is at the heart of human existence, but especially in those moments where we enter into this liminal space where the world seems closer to God, more enchanted, analogous to the fairy world. And then we don't sustain that vision if we enter the dark night of the soul, so to say. We get that intense sense of loss, and perhaps we never recover it fully until we return to heaven. And so, yeah, so that's how I would frame the poem itself.
Interesting. One of the things that they all seem to be reflecting on in the different points you made in reading from Lewis and others just now is the almost residue of a place that we think might be out there, or something historically, right? Like you talked about the water still carrying the music of creation. And there's a line in this poem that I'd love for you to speak to in the second stanza. I believe it's like the seventh line, eighth line, but it bore me away, wetted with spray, wrapped in a mist, wound in a sleep. And this is the line, to a forgotten strand in a strange land. And there's this echo of it's it's unfamiliar, but it's not unknown somewhere deep within us. And I'm just curious if you have any thought to that expression in poetry and in fairy and in, as you say, that human experience of this journey to a place that we've never been, but it feels like maybe we have some recollection of it in our collective consciousness.
Yes, and the way you phrase that absolutely brilliantly, this kind of echo that we haven't heard, this echo of a history in our collective consciousness, because one of the things that is in the line to a forgotten strand in a strange land, the strange land is itself an echo to the Bible, where we are told that the Israelites were strangers in a strange land of Egypt, and so they ought to be kind to strangers. But from a kind of perspective, all human history is a kind of exile, banished from paradise but not yet admitted to the New Jerusalem. So I would be inclined to say that the poem Strange Land of Faerie is less a reference to the afterlife than to a reference to this world seen from a visionary perspective and the longing to the afterlife and to the new creation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. One of the things I think that it's the modern day philosopher, theologian John Milbank, who has commented from time to time on the existence of fairy as being real in a way that I think George MacDonald would also say, it's more real than what we think of as real. And I'm using that to frame my next question for you is when this protagonist arrives and there's a line, oh, let's see, it's down a bit, but he says, but wherever I came, it was ever the same. The feet fled and all was still. Never a greeting, only the fleeting pipes, voices, horns on the hill. And it's that idea of whether it be leprechauns or fairies or any mystical creature or being that they hide whenever the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve are there, and all you hear is that you thought you caught a glimpse or you thought you heard something, and then they're gone. What is that getting at in your estimation?
Yes. I mean, generically, these ever incipient, ever vanishing creatures certainly do belong to the world of fairy, and they find their way into The Hobbit. When Bilbo and the dwarves are famished in Mirkwood, they glimpse the elves with feast and flame, but when they approach the fire snuff, the food is gone, and gone with it all the elves. But the reality of fairy is a difficult question. In the Fellowship, Frodo says to Gildor, half in jest, "Go not to elves for counsel, for they will say both no and yes." And while I have it on good authority, and you do as well, you have it on Milbank, I have it on David Bentley Hart's dog Roland, that fairies
Yes.
are real. I have my doubts. I believe that the world is enchanted. It's charged with the grandeur of God, flaming, shining, and gathering to a greatness, as Gerard Manley Hopkins tells us. But I'm a bit more skeptical on fairies. They could be entities that could be real, that could not be real. Perhaps my opinion would change if I was brought up in the English countryside. But I do. Um, but if one believes in angels, for example, which I think is a plausible thing for many Christians, one can imagine myriads of numinous presences throughout nature. As John Henry Newman, now a doctor of the church, I believe, said of angels, every breath of air and ray of light and heat, every beautiful prospect is, as it were, the skirts of their garments, the waving of the robes of those whose faces see God. And perhaps I might say that fairyland is only as real as Earth is real, though perhaps more real than we typically think of Earth as being. As someone like Sir Philip Sidney would say, the world of nature is brazen, but the poets deliver us a world of gold.
Yes. Oh, that's lovely. I, 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 I think part of me, Brett, not to get personal, but part of me was perhaps hoping that someone of your youth would still hearken back to the sort of universal fascination that all children have with finding the fairies out there. But I'd love to divert actually because of the region that you're from in the Fraser Valley and where I live just south of there in the U.S. And one of the mythical beings in our region is the Sasquatch. So, any any thoughts on Sasquatch when you were growing up there in the Fraser Valley?
No, not particularly, but I do have many thoughts about the Sasquatch because I worked at a local museum, and so because Sasquatch was such a big thing, I did research about the folklore around Sasquatch, and it's a very vexed matter because in ways it belongs to specific indigenous traditions of the area, but it's also been, and it has this kind of angelic, semi-divine figure to some, and on the other hand, it's been so thoroughly commercialized. So I'm basically just going to say it's a very complex matter that I didn't have thoughts about when growing up, but now have politically complex feelings about.
Understood. Well, maybe we'll do a Sasquatch series down the road. There's much more pressing matters at this point. It didn't happen to be the center at the Harrison River Valley, did it, that you worked?
No, but I worked at the area. I worked at the Agassiz Harrison Museum and was a
Okay.
curator, so they were like one of our sister organizations. We had contacts with them.
Yeah, on one of my trips to Abbotsford to visit with the lovely Ron Dart, I don't know if you've ever come across his work.
Oh, I have, yes, and I've met him at the Inklings Institute of Canada. He's a lovely guy and knows everybody.
Truly, he truly does. But after visiting him, the friend that I was with, we stopped by that little Sasquatch museum at the Harrison River Valley. So, anyway, back to the poem. Um, I I was reflecting on the stanza in which the character creates his own coronation, as it were. Of river leaves and the rush sheaves, he made a mantle of jewel green, a tall wand to hold, and a flag of gold. Um, and yet, none spoke wherever he went. And so, I don't know what your thoughts on that are, but I thought about in two ways. One, hearkening back to the biblical, the Genesis, um, I don't know, mandate of for humans to take dominion, and then also the flip side for that, if humans to seize power. And what do you have any thoughts on that stanza?
Yes, I mean you frame it well with the idea of dominion as it comes forth in Genesis, because, well, in the poem at least, the coronation is premature, and it shows the character's pride, in my mind. If he is to have dominion over himself, he must give up his impulse to dominate others. As John 3:30 tells us, Christ must increase, but I must decrease. And I think part of the issue of Genesis is that perhaps there is a sense that this is something that humans should do, but in a humble way, in the right way, in a virtuous way. So that even at the end of the book of Job, for instance, you have the reworking of the creation story from God's account, and it culminates in Leviathan, who is called king over all the children of pride. And so it's almost as though, and I think Catherine Keller argues this, that mankind in its pride has almost abdicated its royal prerogative, so to say, and given it over to Leviathan, who in turn, yeah. But yeah, sorry, lots of
No,
ideas. That's something.
that's great. Whatever you like to share, I love hearing your thoughts. So then you have that passage, and then the very next, at the end of it, of course, he sort of cries out, "Answer my call, come forth all, speak to me words." Almost as you point out, the passage where Job is crying out, and then boom, black came a cloud as a night shroud, like a dark mole groping I went, to the ground falling, on my hands crawling, with eyes blind and my back bent. And he experiences that, he doesn't have as much power as he thought. And he then spends a year and a day in this wooden, I don't know, to me it's almost like a tomb. Any thoughts on this passage as it juxtaposes with his premature grasping and prideful arrogance?
Yes, well, now I want to think about the Job connection further, but there's probably some kind of academic article in that which will be done at a
That's
later
okay.
time. But, a year and a day is a traditional fairy tale time span. The stay in the wooded tomb likely signifies regeneration, or at least partial regeneration. Purgatorial process in which the character learns the self-abnegation that I mentioned before. He tried to crown himself, but the crown is not his to give, and so he needs to be redeemed in some way. In the Divine Comedy, the last words that Virgil, Dante's guide through hell and purgatory, says to him are, "Lord of thyself I crown and mitre thee." But even if this character isn't exactly passing through purgatory, I think his suffering here is purgatorial, and that even when this period ends, he'll still need to go through further purification.
Thank you. We're nearing the end already. Hard to believe, but there's a boat that carries him away, and I have two thoughts on it. One, in this particular context, obviously it makes sense because it's how he arrived. But I would love for you to discuss any thoughts you have on the boat in this instance, and then more broadly, as you pointed out with the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, there's so much in our origins, especially pre automotive and flight, with respect to being out on the open seas and traveling via boat, that is very romanticized in these tales, but also very symbolic. So any thoughts you have on that, the floor is wide open.
Yes, yes. So I think that the boat signifies, on one level, the transition from a level of higher vision to a different level of vision, from the elevated visionary plane of fairyland to the world of ordinary experience. And it's very interesting that initially, when he finds the boat, he can just say, "Bear me away," and it bears him away. But this time, he has to go looking for the boat and wait, and he needs to learn patience. That's one of the things that the boat does for him. I quoted some lines from Keats earlier. Keats's next lines read, "Forlorn the very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my sole self." In Tolkien's poem, the boat seems to be the vehicle that that brings the character back to his soul self. But while Keats's speaker questions whether his experience was a vision or a waking dream, Tolkien's character is wholly convinced of his visionary voyage, and so appears mad to those whom he encounters in the ordinary world, who now flee him even as the fairies fled from him in fairyland. And just of the larger archetypal level of the ocean, I mean, there are so many sea narratives. The Odyssey is the obvious one. The salt water is often seen as a kind of primeval chaos in the book of Genesis, and the phrase that's translated as the deep is cognate to a word for Tiamat, the Babylonian goddess of salt water, who in Mesopotamian myth is slain to create the world. And that myth is kind of one of the subtexts for the Book of Job, where you get this other sea monster, Leviathan. Yes, this would tie very neatly into an article, I think. But there's this overcoming of the chaos, which seems to be something that's either resistant to God's creative power or something from which God creates. And so, if you want to see it as a regeneration, passing over the sea could be a kind of baptism image, especially if you see it as a kind of submersion and return in which the flood has now subsided. You can get to a new state of life. But the one thing that makes problematic is what kind of new life is the character coming to. Like I said before, people are ignoring them. They seem mad. They give away everything that they have, which is an extreme act of renunciation, which corrects his error of pride. But it seems slightly like the character was forced to become this eremitic hermit figure, so it seems partly forced upon the speaker rather than an inward change of themselves. But yes.
Thank you so much. One of the things that I was fascinated in the years gone by with the early creation mythology, and you referencing Tiamat, and this has nothing to do with the poem necessarily, but it is always fascinating to me to see the similarities in these various creation accounts. And in the Tiamat story, Marduk and Tiamat fight, and then out of Tiamat's death is where the creation comes of Tiamat's body. And so much symbolism there, with death, burial, resurrection, new life coming after death. Anyway, that's just an aside that struck me since you brought that up. I always enjoy catching up with you, Bret. I always enjoy hearing your thoughts, and I'd love for you to conclude this conversation with because it strikes me, as you pointed out, this final stanza, it's again this phenomenon that happens so often with characters in stories, poetry, but also in our own lives. When you experience a revelation of sorts or a transcendent experience and you return to the regular, ordinary, everyday, those around you see differently, but they don't see what you see, and the effect that it has on the actual person who experienced it seems to be happening with this character. But I'd love for you to, any final thoughts on the final stanza, and then on Frodo's dream generally to close us out.
Yes. I mean, on the final stanza, I think that part of it is absolutely that aspect of the character has experienced this vision, which they find is truly incommunicable to others, and even if they could communicate it, they couldn't get them to believe it, to to believe it, they need to experience it themselves. And so they are in the state of exile, so the world of ordinary experience becomes for them a kind of strange land. They're strangers in a strange land themselves now. So there's that. And it's very analogous to the way the Rime of the Ancient Mariner ends, where even though the mariner had blessed the water snakes, he had gotten back to his own country, he had been shriven by the hermit good that lives in the wood, he still is cursed to go from land to land, sharing his story. And so there's still that need of further purgation, need of something else, which I think is also true to life. We live in the middle of things. Our stories haven't ended yet. And sometimes there's tragedy in life, and perhaps were we able to narrate the poem further to its ending, it would turn out that the tragedy would be but one episode in a larger romance or a comedy, which, if this is Frodo's dream, then perhaps it is. I suppose one thing that I forgot to say, actually there are two things I forgot to say in the background section of this. One is that I believe that Tolkien writes in the introduction to the volume or somewhere that this might be inspired by Hobbit legends of the dreams that Frodo had in his last years, on the anniversaries of the times that he was either wounded by the Nazgul or stung by Shelob. And so there's this trauma, which even as it was partially healed, would repeat in these bad dreams. And so that's one aspect, but even so, Frodo won. He was able to go to Valinor. Many of his friends eventually will join him in Valinor. And even if there's a melancholy aspect, there's still a sense of a greater redemption on the horizon, which is important to locate that as a perspective for this poem. And the one other thing, which is just a fun fact, is that I believe that W.H. Auden, the famous poet, thought that the Sea Bell, or Frodo's Dream, was the best of Tolkien's poems.
Wonderful. Oh, thanks for sharing that. Again, thank you for your time today. And I'm just curious if there are any conventions, conferences on the horizon that you'll be participating in, or anything else you got that you're working on that would interest folks.
Yes, things on the horizon, mostly Toronto-bound things, just so that I'm not going here and there like I did last year and the year before. But I'll be helping out with a Northrop Frye working group through the Center for Renaissance and Reformation Studies here, and I'll also be presenting on Wallace Stevens and John Milton at an Amigfa event is what it's called, also at the Renaissance, or Center for Renaissance and Reformation Studies here.
Full. Well, Brent Van den Brink, it's always a pleasure. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Today's episode of The Plunge is, it's not going to be sponsored by me reading a poem. Are you kidding? Today's episode of The Plunge is going to be sponsored by a repeat of the poem that Bret read to us in this episode. The Sea Bell, or Frodo's Dream, by J.R.R. Tolkien. I don't know about you, but I think I could listen to Bret read poems all day, every day. And so, without further ado, thank you, The Sea Bell, for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.
The Sea Bell. I walked by the sea, and there came to me, as a starbeam on the wet sand, a white shell, like a sea bell, trembling it lay in my wet hand. In my fingers shaken I heard waken a ding within, by our harbor bar, a buoy swinging, a call ringing, over endless seas, faint now and far. Then I saw a boat silently float on the night tide, empty and grey. It is later than late, why do we wait? I leapt in and cried, bear me away. It bore me away, wetted with spray, wrapped in a mist, wound in a sleep, to a forgotten strand in a strange land, in the twilight beyond the deep. I heard a sea bell swing in the swell, dinging, dinging, and the breakers roar on the hidden teeth of a perilous reef, and at last I came to a long shore. White it glimmered, and the sea simmered, with star mirrors in a silver net. Cliffs of stone pale as rule bone, and the moon foam were gleaming wet. Glittering sand slid through my hand, dust of pearl and jewel grist, trumpets of opal, roses of coral, flutes of green and amethyst. But under cliff eaves there were glooming caves, weed-curtained, dark and grey. A cold air stirred in my hair, and the light waned as I hurried away. Down from a hill ran a green rill, its water I drank to my heart's ease. Up its fountain stair to a country fair, of every eve I came, far from the seas. Climbing into meadows of fluttering shadows, flowers lay there like fallen stars, and on a blue pool, glassy and cool, like floating moons the nenuphars. Alders were sleeping, and willows weeping, by a slow river of rippling weeds. Gladden swords guarded the fords, and green spears and arrow reeds. There was echo of song all the evening long, down in the valley, many a thing running to and fro, hairs white as snow, revolves out of holes, moths on the wing with lantern eyes. In quiet surprise, brocks were staring out of dark doors. I heard dancing there, music in the air, feet going quick on the green floors. But wherever I came, it was ever the same. The feet fled, and all was still. Never a greeting, only the fleeting pipes, voices, horns on the hill. Of river leaves and the rush sheaves I made me a mantle of jewel green, a tall wand to hold, and a flag of gold. My eyes shone like the stars' sheen. With flowers crowned, I stood on a mound, and shrill as a call at cock-crow, proudly I cried, why do you hide? Why do none speak wherever I go? Here now I stand, king of this land, with gladdened sword and reed mace. Answer my call, come forth all, speak to me words, show me a face. Black came a cloud as a night shroud, like a dark mole groping I went, to the ground falling, on my hands crawling, with eyes blind and my back bent. I crept to a wood, silent it stood in its dead leaves, bare were its boughs. There must I sit, wandering in wit, while owls snored in their hollow hells. For a year and a day there must I stay. Beetles were tapping in the rotten trees, spiders were weaving in the mold heaving, puffballs loomed about my knees. At last there came light in my long night, and I saw my hair hanging grey. Bent though I be, I must find the sea. I have lost myself, and I know not the way, but let me be gone. Then I stumbled on, like a hunting bat shadow was over me. In my ears dinned a withering wind, and with ragged briars I tried to cover me. My hands were torn, and my knees worn, and ears were heavy upon my back, when the rain in my face took a salt taste, and I smelt the smell of sea wrack. Birds came sailing, mewing, wailing. I heard voices in cold caves, seals barking and rocks snarling, and in spout holes the gulping of waves. Winter came fast, into a mist I passed, to land's end my years I bore. Snow was in the air, ice in my hair, darkness was lying on the last shore. There still afloat waited the boat, and the tide lifting, its prow tossing. Weary I lay as it bore me away, the waves climbing, the seas crossing. passing old halls clustered with gulls, and great ships laden with light, coming to haven, dark as a raven, silent as snow, deep in the night. Houses were shuttered, wind round them muttered, roads were empty, I sat by a door, and where drizzling rain poured down a drain, I cast away all that I bore. In my clutching hand some grains of sand, and a seashell silent and dead. Never will my ear that bell hear, never my feet that shore tread, never again, as in sad lane, in blind alley and in long street, ragged I walk, to myself I talk, for still they speak not, men that I meet.